everybody welcome Jeff Speck.
Thank you, Councillor Benton. Before I start, Andrew, is that little message going to come up every 15 minutes while I'm speaking? That just came up on the computer? If it is, we'll take a brief intermission. I will hurl the computer to one side, and then we'll start over. Thank you, Councillor Benton. Thank you for the City Council that sponsored this work. Thank you all for coming back. Who was here at my first presentation? Yeah, who was here at my first presentation? Okay. Who was not here at my first presentation? Okay. Yay. I think more of you were here. There will be a little bit of review, so don't worry if you weren't. I have so much to tell you tonight that I'm really worried. I've in fact already cut, since preparing it, I've already cut 3 sections that I just don't have time to show you. And just so you know, those are on homelessness, on parking, and on concert hoodlums. But they'll all be in the report. And there'll be other stuff in the report that I'm not able to show you tonight, but there's just so much, there's so many different issues that all impact the walkability of Albuquerque that this is a very long talk. I promise you it won't be a boring talk, except for one point I'll warn you about. I'll say this is the boring part, but the necessary part. So I was here, I have an advancer. I was here, as you know, in March. I presented at the Andalus to many of you. It was a great audience. There was a lot of great interest. I was really thrilled at the response. And the question is, what happened since? And basically, this happened since. These are all the meetings I had after that presentation, all the people I met with. And then this also happened, which is one of the pages of chicken scratch, of just spending many, many, many hours walking around the city. But in all these meetings, no one asked me, why are you here? People are very polite. But I said, the reason I'm here is to figure out how you, in the least amount of time, spending the least amount of money, can actually experience the greatest increase in the number of people walking and biking in downtown Albuquerque. And whether I do that in a very short amount of time will be an indication of whether I've been successful or not, or I should say, whether we together have been successful, because if you don't move forward with some of these recommendations, of course, then you can't blame me. Now, the last talk was towards a walkable Albuquerque. Now we're talking about making a walkable Albuquerque. That was the what to do, and tonight is what to do in Albuquerque. But let's say making Albuquerque walkable. And this is the study area. The study area is one census tract. It's bounded by Lomas to the north, Cole to the south. I'm going to try to refrain from pointing at the screen too much just because it slows things down. 8th to the west, and essentially Broadway to the east. So that's all I was looking at. There are lots of other parts of town that are somewhat walkable, particularly over towards the university, that could be more walkable, but that wasn't my charge to look at them. So a quick review. We began by saying, if a vital place is full of pedestrians, how do you get people to walk? And that's the general theory of walkability that is in my book. And it essentially says this. In America, where walking is, driving is so easy and cheap. You don't pay the full cost. The car sits between you and everything. If you're going to get people to walk, then the walk has to be better or as good as the drive. So the walk has to simultaneously do 4 things. And if it doesn't do all 4 of these things in a certain precinct or in a certain street, then people won't make the choice to walk. The walk has to be useful, the walk has to be safe, the walk has to be comfortable, and the walk has to be interesting. And this too is the framework now for talking about the recommendations that I'll be sharing with you tonight. So first I'm simplifying, I'm putting comfortable and interesting together, and then for the sake of the best way to explain this, I'm reordering it. We're going to start with the safe walk, then move on to the comfortable, interesting walk, and end with the useful walk. That's the structure of tonight's talk. The safe walk is broken up into a few chapters. We're going to talk about what the safety factors are. That's a little bit of a review from last time. The infamous development process manual, supply and demand, the cycling network, one-ways, other individual streets, and signalization. So let's start with safety factors. What are they? Well, they're design speed, number of lanes, lane width, turn lane presence and length, curb protection, bike lanes, one-way versus two-way streets, curb radii, and signals. And I'll be talking to you about each of those things. First, design speed is really important. It's more important here in Albuquerque than in a lot of places where I work, because here, for example, in your DPM, in your development process manual, there is an inherent implied design speed of certain streets. And what I have to stress, I tell audiences this and they kind of don't believe me, because if you haven't been trained as a traffic engineer, this makes no sense. But we intentionally design streets for higher speeds than we set the speed limits on, and for higher speeds than we want people to go on them, because of the drunk texting at midnight. And that's been the technique for many years, and only recently in the field of traffic engineering has there been a new understanding, which is actually that when you infer a higher speed, you cause your typical driver who's not drunk to go a higher speed. And that when you design with clear zones and with extra wide lanes and with no trees and all these other things that make the drunk safe, you actually cause every driver to speed up. So you get streets like this, where of course you have to put the radar enforced sign above the street because it's a highway designed for 50 miles an hour and labeled 25 miles an hour. And design speed is essential because when you're hit by a car going 35, you're 8 times as likely to die as when you're hit by a car going 25. So the design speed that underlies our streets and roads is really important. And in fact, all the other things I'm going to be talking about relate back to design speed. Design speed controls some of them, but all of them imply, the way we answer each of these questions implies a certain design speed. And clearly you want speeds downtown. Frankly, we want the streets to be designed to encourage the speeds that we sign and the speeds that we consider are safe downtown, and not faster, or you encourage speeding. Number of lanes is a very straightforward discussion. The more lanes there are, the more there are to cross, and so the question is, do you have more lanes than you need? And not saying, oh, we should limit the amount of traffic, but how much traffic do we have? We know how much traffic a lane can handle. Do we have the right number of lanes for the traffic we have? And so a place like Oklahoma City, where the mayor came to me because they were named the worst city for pedestrians in the entire country, it's because they had streets like this that were actually designed over large in anticipation of traffic. And you have the same condition here. You have a lot of streets that have 4 lanes and 3 lanes and 4 lanes and more. Some of them, maybe the number of lanes makes sense. In fact, I'll go through them one by one. But many of them just have a lane or 2 extra that actually isn't doing anyone any good, because 1 lane or 2 lanes less would still handle very easily the traffic that's on it. Next is the width of the lanes. I talked last time about the fact the standards have changed. We've seen this happen for many decades. You know, the subdivision from the 60s and the subdivision from the 80s, and compare the width of the streets, because the standards have just changed. Residents understand this, and they want narrower streets. And people who aren't traffic engineers even have written academic reviewed articles like this one that talk about a real carnage that comes from having lanes that are too wide, that they encourage higher speed. But that has not been the philosophy within the traffic engineering profession. Fortunately, that's changing. This is the Institute of Transportation Engineers, ITE. They are official. They're not, they haven't drunk my Kool-Aid. And they now have this new guideline for urban areas that says 10 to 11 foot lanes. 10 feet is the old standard. 11 is nice to have that extra foot for a bus. But the big battle I find myself fighting now, everywhere I go, is 10 versus 12. And 10 versus 12 really matters, because in a 4-lane street or a 5-lane street, those 2 feet add up to your bike lanes, or your parking, or the other things that are going to make that street safe and useful to other people besides speeding drivers. Most places I work, 10 versus 12 is us versus the state DOT. And that will be the case as we try to calm Broadway, which is a state road. But here in Albuquerque, it's us versus us, because our own public works rules actually have established, as you see in a lot of the West, you're not unique, in a lot of the West, the Public Works have adopted from the state this 12-foot standard. So here's the boring part. But I have to do this, because if I don't do this, I'm going to leave, and someone's going to say, Jeff is wrong, 12-foot lanes are safer. And I'm saying right now, I'm right, because I looked it up, and I keep looking it up, and I keep asking all the traffic engineers I meet to give me the reports and the data. This is all the data we have. First, we're going to look at crash rates, we're going to look at crash severity, and then traffic impacts. Crash rates. I told you about this study, doesn't count. Wasn't done by AASHTO or by a traffic engineering consortium. What does AASHTO say? This is the Bible, the Green Book, the AASHTO Green Book. It has no footnotes. Why? Does the Bible have footnotes? It is what most traffic engineers have to follow in order to not be afraid of getting sued. So what does AASHTO say? For rural and urban arterials, lane widths may vary from 10 to 12 feet. Okay, so far we're okay. 12-foot lanes should be used where practical on higher speed, freer flowing principal arterials. Well, do we want high-speed arterials in our downtown? Probably not. However, under signalized conditions operating below 45 miles an hour, narrower lane widths are normally quite adequate and have some advantages. Okay? So we're safe with AASHTO. Next. These are pocket protecting wearing official traffic engineers who probably don't agree with most of the things I say, but this is the Midwest Research Institute, and what they said, a safety evaluation of lane widths for arterial roadway segments found no indication, except in limited cases, that the use of narrower lanes increases crash frequencies. The lane width effects in the analysis conducted were generally either not statistically significant or indicated that narrower lanes were associated with lower rather than higher crash frequencies. Well, that's interesting. Then here's NCHRP 330, another one. All projects evaluated during the study consisted of lane widths exclusively of 10 feet or more versus 12 feet. They resulted in accident rates that were either reduced or unchanged. So far so good. Now what about crash severity? Well, we know this, right? We know that if you're hitting someone going faster, that person is more likely to die. But do wider lanes cause that? We have to prove that. Well, thankfully, the Texas Transportation Institute, extremely conservative group, say on suburban arterials, and this is the only type of road they studied, so we have to take it as a stand-in for every type of road. On suburban arterial straight sections away from traffic signal, higher speed should be expected with greater lane widths. And finally, because people do care about limiting the amount of traffic, we're willing to sacrifice some lives to move traffic through. If we weren't, we would have one-lane streets everywhere, or no-lane streets everywhere. So we are willing to sacrifice lives to move more cars. But what are the impacts? Here's FDOT. So long as all other geometrical and signalization conditions remain constant, there is no measurable decrease in urban street capacity when through lane widths are narrowed from 12 to 10 feet. So no less traffic, or I should say no less flow. So in summary, 10-foot lanes have no more collisions than 12-foot lanes and may have fewer. 10-foot lanes encourage slower speeds, so collisions are less likely to be injurious or deadly. Therefore, 10-foot lanes are safer than 12-foot lanes. It sounds obvious, but I'm making that statement, and I like to run a data-based consultancy, and I welcome new data, but that's the data we've got. If you use a 12-foot lane, and this is the charge now, because it's usually our burden to prove to them, to explain why a lane has to be narrower than 12 feet. But really the burden of proof has to be on the DOTs and the Public Works and other organizations who are pushing for 12 feet, because based on what I just proved, I believe, if you use a 12-foot lane instead of a 10-foot lane, you are killing babies. And I say that because this is the terms that the DOTs use. This is the terms that the fire chiefs use when you try and make a street a little tighter. You're told that there's a human cost to doing something that they think is unsafe, which is a narrower lane. And what I'm saying, which I think is something that needs to be shouted in every state and every city, is that actually there's been a tremendous human cost to using these wider lanes, and we're only just now beginning to understand that. And so we need this 10-foot standard as our new standard. Why should we care? Just today, Albuquerque was named the third most dangerous place to be a pedestrian in the country, the third most pedestrian accidents in the US. So a little gift to me, but it's bad news for you. But we heard this today. So here's your atypical downtown street. It's 45 feet from curb to curb and holds what most cities' downtown streets hold in 36 feet. Normally you have 8, 10, 10, 8. Parking, driving, driving, parking. And this is 8, 15, 15, 8. And you can see actually the change of color on the street where the cars drive versus where they don't, implying the 5-foot bike lanes that you might stick in there to use up the extra road width. But this extra width does nothing except to encourage speeding. It doesn't improve the flow, it just invites speeding. Next, turn lane, that was my boring part. Turn lane presence and length. This is a street in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania where I did a study. All the shops on the right are out of business because the DOT needed a 300-foot long left-hand turn lane to serve a street with 5 houses on it that goes nowhere. But these are the standards they apply. In many states and many cities, their standard solution to using up that asphalt is to put a left-hand turn lane in, and to often have it run the full length of the block. Or you have half of it run half of it runs one half of the block, and the other half runs the other half of the block. And these lanes shouldn't be put in because left-hand turn lanes widen streets and speed cars. They shouldn't be there unless there is congestion caused by cars turning left, right? Correct? So yes, they belong in the intersections where we need them to smooth flow turning left, but you don't need them everywhere. And secondly, they should be no longer than necessary because the longer they are, the wider they're making the street for a longer time. And you have some really great short ones. I showed this one in the last city I went to because it's a great standard. So you have both types here. This is a type that I would like to see more frequent, very short. See how close the parking is to the corner, and then the parking ends, and then the left-hand turn lane is very small. And when you have low numbers of cars turning left, this is proper. Curb protection, we talk about parked cars, the barrier of steel that protects the sidewalk from moving vehicles. Happy hour in Fort Lauderdale, notice one side of the street is parked, one isn't. This is the parked side, this is the sad hour on the unparked side. People don't want to be on sidewalks that don't have parked cars against them. Some of your sidewalks, you're not allowed to have cars parked on them, but the GSA, the federal buildings folks, are notoriously inconsistent. And I know plenty of federal buildings that have parking in front of them. So there's probably someone you can write a letter to and address the issue of where you're not allowed to have parking by the federal government. But you have this amazing collection all over your city of red and yellow stripes in places I just can't for the life of me figure out why they're there. Some of them are bus lanes that are 10 times as long as any bus queue will ever be. Some of them are fire zones against 40-foot streets, like you have trucks that wide. Some of them are corner clears that are 50 feet long instead of the normal 10 feet long. But they're everywhere. And there are too many for me to measure them. So what I'm suggesting is that the next step that someone else do is to do an inventory of these, and then to just inventory what all your empty curbs are, and then find out why they are striped that way, and ask the question, is it really necessary? And some will be necessary, but there are plenty, and I'll be pointing them out specifically in my report and naming them. There are plenty of them that are not justified clearly. Bike lanes. We all know that biking is a revolution in only some American cities. Those cities like Portland that invest in bike infrastructure have been seeing a tremendous increase in the number of bicyclists. Chicago with its, this is the gold standard that's now being applied all over the country, and soon here, if I'm at all successful. That's called the buffered lane, the cycle track. It can be one lane, it can be 2 lanes, but notice there's parked cars protecting it from the street, or a buffer protecting it from the street, or a buffer protecting it from the parked cars. And this version is the ideal version, where you pull it off the curb, you pull the parking off the curb, put the bikes in between. Here's Prospect Park West in New York City, where they did just that, and they went from 3 lanes to 2. And so the question is, what's the safety ramifications? Well, here, yes, the number of cyclists tripled, Speeding dropped from 75% to 17%. Injury crashes dropped by 63%. And the automobile volume even didn't drop at all. So it's a win-win-win. There's plenty of opportunities here. I'll be showing you where for having this sort of lane. You don't want them everywhere. No one's putting them in every street, but you want a sparse network of these lanes that get you close to each place in downtown, but not directly there necessarily. This is just 2 days ago in the Seattle news. You can see this biker at the bottom here. Your conventional bike path, I should say bike lane, up against the parked car. There's a place for these, and I will end up recommending some of them in my report. But this is considered a death trap because it's between the car doors and the vehicles, and it's one of many bike lanes that Seattle is changing to what you see here, which is the green is the bike lane, and the stripes, those bright, I'll just use my laser, the stripes are parking zone. So again, you're parking here, driving here, biking there. So, you guys are about 2 steps behind in that you have very few bike lanes downtown, even the integrated kind, but then you have this bike boulevard. And a bike boulevard is part of the things that cities can do to encourage cyclists, but it's really just a really cute sign with an 18-mile-an-hour speed limit on a street that's pretty safe to bike on because it's narrow. And bike boulevards are what I would call a share-o situation, where the bikes and the cars are sharing, is something that if we size your streets properly, it'll be possible to do that on almost every street. But if we want to generate cyclists, if we want to create a biking population, and there are many, many reasons why we do, from health on down, to attract millennials, to help our workforce, many of whom are on bikes. If we want to attract and create a biking population, then we need marked lanes, and we ideally need buffered lanes. One-way versus two-way streets, multi-lane one-way streets, which exist all over the US and were principally almost entirely converted from two-way streets, feel much less safe to pedestrians because of that sheer momentum of all those cars going in the same direction. And as a driver, there's always the temptation to jockey from lane to lane. As long as there's another lane, that lane's faster, right? So you jockey. And having that extra lane and the opportunity to jockey is what makes drivers much more dangerous in these sort of situations. We talked last time about the impacts on retail and how these conversions killed retail main streets all around the country, and when those streets were reverted to two-way, like Vancouver, Washington, the businesses' revenues doubled. In Vancouver, they doubled. In Savannah, a street was one-wayed in '69, and 64% of the business addresses went away. And when it was converted back to two-way, 50% of the businesses came back pretty quickly. So it's not just safer, but it's good for business. And you, of course, have the Marquette and Tierras pair right here, which I wasn't sure what my reaction would be at first, but I think it becomes very clear once I learn what the volumes are on them, that they can be two-way quite easily with a few little tricks. Here they are. And they invite speeding because you speed. I speed on them. Curb radii, one of the details, what's the corner curb radius here? Is it 1 foot or is it 40 feet? Which determines whether a 20-foot crossing is really 20 feet or 35 feet, and how fast that vehicle is going because of that big swoop. That's really important too. Your old standard, which you find in the heart of downtown, is about a 10 or 12-foot curb radius. But your new standard, which you find, for example, eastward on MLK, is closer to 20 feet and up. And I'll show you this in the DPM, in the manual. And when you want to fix a street downtown, you have to apply the new suburban standard in the center of the city. And then all the little details, whether they communicate vehicular environment or a pedestrian environment. Swoops. Swoops always tell people this is a car place. This is the failed addition to City Center in Las Vegas. It says, some say the entrance to City Center is not inviting to pedestrians because of the swoops. And so you've got the best I mean, this is fortunately missing from most of your downtown, but you have this one part of your downtown that was engineered at the time of swoops. And it's about as swoopy as you can get, and it used to be even swoopier, as you see here, with the piece that was smartly removed, and the piece that's about to be smartly removed. Congratulations, that's great. But even just walking here, you can't even cross the street. It's really interesting to be a pedestrian here. You can't get to the train station. But that's about to be fixed. And you see how cars just lean as they come around that corner. And then finally, signal provision. This is only something I've learned in the last year. You know, this is sculpture, this is not, but we have a lot of signals in this country. In Davenport, Iowa, where I was working, it was the same company that told them how many signals to have, sold them the signals. And that's what they have in a lot of places. And so, I was working in West Palm Beach, and I said to the head of Public Works, who I was kind of working for, I said, look, I think that, I just feel it, that four-way stop signs are safer for intersections that don't have a ton of traffic, for intersections in which signals are not warranted. And that's a technical term, warranted. I feel like a four-way stop sign is safer than a signal because cars are stopping at every intersection, there's a lot of eye contact, bicyclists just blow through, right? It's a calmer environment. And she said, I feel safer in signalized intersections. So I said, well, that's very interesting. Let's find the data. And this is all the data we could find. It's a big study in Philadelphia where the warrants changed and they had to remove 472 signals from downtown Philadelphia. They collected a ton of data and they found crashes dropped 24%. And severe injury crashes dropped 63%, and severe pedestrian injury crashes dropped 68%. So there is a difference. This is funny. Traffic engineers in Philadelphia believe that the safety benefit stems from the elimination of the local habit of speeding up to beat the red, as if that's a local habit in Philadelphia. So, if you're over-signaled and you want to be safer, then we should eliminate the signals where they're not necessary. And here's a little trick. If you eliminate a signal from an intersection, you don't need a left-hand turn lane anymore, right? Think about it. At the four-way stop, the car across the way is pausing for you whether you're going straight or left. So it's also a way to get rid of that extra asphalt of the left-hand turn lane. So these are all the safety factors. Let's move on to our second category, which is the infamous development process manual. This is what you have to follow to build anything in Albuquerque, and it's really hard to get around it, and most jobs just follow it because that's the easy way to do things. This is the residential standard. I don't know if you can see, but it's 12 feet. This is a residential street, 12 feet with 8-foot parking. It's wider than many main streets that I've been to. This is the best residential street in terms of walkability that I came across during my study. This is Roma, west of 7th. And it's a classic queuing street. This is the sort of street you should be able to, if not be required to build in your low-density, single-family subdivisions, because it's a parent's dream. You know, you want your kid growing up on this street because the chances of them being hit by a fast-moving car are nil. Yet because it violates the DPM, this sign has to go up, right? Which is basically this, because there's this violation. But the violating street is the safer street. And here's the DPM where it says, these are curb radii, and look, where a collector intersects a collector, it's 30-foot curb radius. That's as big as the one I showed you in that comparison here, right? Or close to, that's about a 30-foot curb radius. And that curb radius is being applied then to downtown streets as well. Speeding cars. Now, here's another thing that's in the DPM, which is design speed. Do you see these speeds? So if you have a principal arterial, or a minor arterial, or a collector, which are the principal streets in downtown, you have a design speed of 35, 45, or 50 miles an hour. Now again, that's not the marked speed, but the rule says, if I'm reading the DPM correctly, and I think I am, it says that you've got to have very high design speeds downtown. The red streets are principal arterials. The green streets are minor arterials, and the blue streets are collectors. And I took the liberty of putting in the traffic counts. And the first point I want to make is that this is called functional classification. There's a whole bunch of traffic engineers who are trying to get rid of functional classification in urban downtowns. Or I should say add a new category to it, which is urban downtown. Because functional classification was created by the suburbs, for dendritic branching systems in which you have arterials, collectors, and local streets. But that's not what a grid is. A grid, traffic flows intelligently and redisperses itself through the grid, which is why this turns out to be totally arbitrary. Look, we have red streets, we have principal arterials, 6,000, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000. We have minor arterials, 7,000, 4,000, 4,000, 7,000, and we have an urban collector, 5,000. There's no correspondence. If you were to chart it for a regression analysis, it would just be a cloud. So there's no correspondence at all. It doesn't belong downtown. So it's arbitrary. But secondly, there's these design speeds associated with the different street types that tell us that lead is 35, and Sixth is 45, and Second is 50, and MLK is 50. And these are the design speeds applied to these streets. And you want to know why you don't feel safe on them. So there's a real problem with the DPM. So until we do something better, I just want to relabel the cover of the DPM. And I should say that there's good news. The city is working to replace the DPM with the Unified Development Ordinance. And the Unified Development Ordinance is an opportunity to replace all of those bad rules with rules that give the pedestrian a fighting chance and cyclists a fighting chance. And I'm very hopeful that one of the things this study can do is contribute to the intelligence behind that new document, the Unified Development Ordinance. Supply and demand. Here's where we get to the heart of the matter. This is a city document. It's got daily counts on many of your downtown streets. This is another city document. You've got a lot of great hourly counts, peak hour counts. And what really matters, if I'm going to convince anyone to narrow a street, is the peak hourly count. Because you might have a real rush at rush hour, and you do. You know, your rush minute is very busy. So let me also say, though, that in the DPM, look at this. This is also in the DPM. It presumes an annual growth rate of X% over year, every year. The annual growth rate takes you to, in the future, you've got to have roads that are, in some cases, 271% as large. Now, that's the most extreme. But guess what? Vehicle miles traveled in New Mexico has declined since 2007, like the rest of the country mostly. It's down about 10%, which is kind of like the rest of the country. And it's not going up again. Everyone's saying this. State DOTs, like Arizona, are saying this. We know it's not going to go up anymore. We don't need any more streets. Yet the DPM still says that it's going to go up. And then people say, oh, but development's coming, right? Aren't you encouraging development? Isn't the development that you encourage going to cause more trips? Say, actually, development is one of the reasons why it's going down. Because for the past 10 years in America, we've seen people moving to cities. And we've seen urban development and mixed-use development and more housing in downtown. And the sort of development that we're seeing in cities is making traffic less. So in fact, we have to presume that no growth is happening in our streets. And the street changes I'm recommending to you all have a tremendous amount of wiggle room in them, a tremendous amount of leeway. But we can be very confident that we won't need it. Now here's important math. One well-networked lane on a two-way street, so you got a two-way street in a grid, it can handle about 650 cars per peak hour. And just so you know, it's one way, it can handle about 800 cars per peak hour. Engineers are fond of saying, basically in the same circumstance, that a standard two-lane street handles 10,000 cars per day. Okay? And if you have a three-lane street, which means you have center turn lanes at all significant intersections, you double the capacity of the street. Now I can say that with confidence because I showed you this chart last time. These are all streets that have been narrowed from 4-laners to 3-laners. 4 lanes replaced by 2 lanes plus a center turn lane. And you see that they average about 20,000 cars per day. What you also see is the volume does not drop. On average, the volume stays the same. So actually you have a number of 4-laners that can become 3-laners, and we're doing that, I hope. But the main point is, a 3-laner handles 20,000 cars per day, okay? Here are the traffic counts. You can't see it from there. But now I've ranked every street. Red is significant traffic, moderate is green, light is blue, negligible is yellow, okay? And the counts are on there for us to use. You can see them now, and when we look street by street, we'll be looking at the counts. But let's look at just one intersection, 6th and Tijeras. At this intersection, 6th has peak hour of 749 cars. That's almost one lane, but 650 is one lane, so we're definitely in 2-lane territory. Tijeras has 588. That's almost one lane. I mean, it is one lane. But look, Tijeras is 4 lanes, and 6th is 4 lanes. So we're oversized. So I say restripe. We'll have a beer after. But what we do is restripe, and what I'm reminding myself with this image to tell you is that with very few exceptions, and my exceptions are expensive, but with very few exceptions, almost everything I'm recommending, I always begin with the existing roadway, and I just use paint and signals, and I never try to move a curb. Because you can restripe an entire, you can restripe one street for the length of downtown for the price of rebuilding it for 1 block. And so it's about taking what we have, conserving resources, understanding that cities are regularly repaving and restriping every day, and spending that money on the right model instead of the wrong model. Now, let's talk about the cycling network. This is the current cycling network, and the yellow doesn't really count, because the yellow are just shared routes. So the shared routes are helpful, like the bicycle boulevard on Silver. They're helpful, but they don't really generate cyclists. So what you have is Central coming in. That was a good diet that you guys did. And Tijeras and Marquette and Tijeras coming in. And then, of course, the green that exists across the plaza and has now been replaced with a very bikeable, will be a bikeable street on 4th. But you can see there's very little, and there's also a ton of gaps. These are all places where we're lacking connectivity. Now, this is, as I can best understand, I may have gotten it wrong, this is the current proposal. And a lot of people have worked really hard to get this far. And I want to say I respect that effort, but it's not ambitious enough. And if you look again at what sort of bike lanes are possible with a newfound understanding of what sort of space is available, and in fact what sort of space we want to use up to stop speeding, then you can be much more aggressive about bike lanes. So this has Marquette and Tijeras coming through more and connecting, and a more significant 4th Street thanks to the great 50-mile loop, and a few other things, lead and coal being a little bit better, but still a ton of gaps. And nowhere near as robust as what other cities are doing. This is what I recommend. It's a little bit complicated, but not really. We'll talk about Broadway eventually, but Broadway is in the Edo plan to be and this is a state street, so when you fix it, you have to fix it for a lot of money, or the state won't do it. So Broadway is planned to be a boulevard with side aisles that are good for biking. So it's basically a shared way. Now, when Innovate ABQ is built, we can have a dedicated bikeway along its whole edge. So that can be actually, green means dedicated bikeway off the street. Purple means shared lanes. And you see that here and elsewhere I'll show you. Shared lanes that you share with cars because they're slow. And those are the side lanes of the boulevard on a future Broadway. Blue is the trick. Blue are these buffered bike lanes. And what you see is a very easy change to MLK, which I'll show you, making those lanes buffered, and the continuation of that system all the way down Marquette and Tijeras until they become very narrow and calm. Similarly, it's very easy to make the lanes on Central coming in buffered, but then there's no room for buffered lanes, so you have integrated. Red means just normal integrated lanes in the street the standard way. Integrated lanes on Central, and then continuing through into Edo. Here, 4th Street has a variety of widths, but it tends to be very little traffic, narrow, and calm. So you see basically this is like whatever fits. This is the best facility that we can fit in each street while preserving parking because parking is really important for businesses and for protecting the curb. And then finally, 6th Street is super wide with extra lanes, as we see, and so that has room for a cycle track until there's no more room, and then it becomes a shared space again. And then finally, the bike lanes that are kind of half coming in from the east on lead and coal, there's room for them to continue as cycle tracks, again one way, until they become skinny and you don't need the cycle tracks. So what is it? It's every even street, 2, 4, 6, and then it's MLK becoming Tierras and Marquette, it's Central, and it's the lead and coal. So it's the even streets, the one-way pairs, and Central. And that's a sparse network. It's not every street, but it's enough to get you within a block or two of every destination, and it's a luxurious network that we have room for and that we can create for the price of paint. And I'll show you street by street in a minute. One-ways, we talked about Tierras and Marquette. I should say Marquette and Tierras. The first thing that's happening is this curve we talked about is being eliminated. So that's gone. But next, the question is, can these go? And the question is answered by how much traffic is on them, and do they need to be this number of lanes? Because when you convert one-way to two-way, you do reduce capacity, because you're taking left-hand turns across traffic, right? When you're on a one-way system, you're never turning across traffic. So you do reduce capacity. So do we have room to reduce capacity? Did anyone notice that Tierras was one lane tonight? Is it still? No, Marquette, excuse me. Marquette is currently one lane at 2nd. And I love little tests like that show you what the system can absorb. So the numbers, as I'll show you, make it very clear that those can become two-way streets. So what is the design? What is my recommendation for Marquette and Tierras? There they are, the one-way pair, coming over and under the railroad tracks. But here's the trick. There's a couple tricks. These parking ramps don't work if you convert it the other way. But guess what? You can flip the gates around. You just go in there and you flip the gates, the in becomes the out becomes the in, and they work perfectly well. You have to do a little restriping on the ground floor. When you land on the lowest level, you're facing oncoming traffic. So you just stripe an angle. People are moving very slowly. It's just paint. You stripe an angle, put up a warning sign for the lawyers, and you cut across. But I'd say it's a high 5-figure item. You can see where they are here. And they're just going the wrong way. There's an in and an out on both sides. But if you reverse them, it works perfectly well. And then there's this one. And this is the ramp from the east into the back of the convention center. And it is a challenge, because if you make this street two-way, and this is two-way, you have a really bad fork right here, with traffic trying to go this way against traffic going that way. And you could do it with a light, but you actually don't need a light, because there are big lines to get out of this facility on occasion, and never a line to get in, if I'm not mistaken. This is what I was told. The crowding is always to exit and almost never to enter. So wouldn't it be great to have a couple more exits and make this an exit only? And then with all the flow coming out, you have a traffic condition where this direction is next to this direction, and there's no conflict at all. So with those two challenges resolved, from this to this, we're able to make them two-way. Now, that's not the radical idea. Here's the craziest thing I'm going to tell you, and I wouldn't tell you to do it unless I thought it was right. But it is radical, because it's not expensive, but it's admitting the folly of an earlier investment. And that earlier investment was replacing old Tierras, which is this narrow street. It's 2 lanes though, or it used to be. This 2-lane Tierras with this new Tierras that swoops through the site. And in fact, this new Tierras does a bunch of things, but it takes a tremendous amount of property away from developable Innovate ABQ and from developable land. It's not just the street, it's all the stuff you gotta do to dig down to the street. It's a tremendous amount of property that has value. And it could very well be that just filling it in and switching back to old Tierras would be the most financially rewarding solution to this area. So you see the old Tierras here, and the new Tijeras here. Note the new Tijeras dips down much earlier than the old Tijeras, which is important because within ABQ we want to bring Union Square, also known as John Street, we want to bring that across, and we can't bring it across where there's a dip in the way. But you see, there's the big one, there's the narrower one. That's new Tijeras, this is old Tijeras. If you pave this, repave it from curb to curb, it's about 21 feet. That's two 10.5-foot lanes, good enough for buses too. And buses like 11, but they like 11, they don't need 11. They're 8.5 feet wide. Guess what happens when a bus passes a bus? They slow down. Not the end of the world. So what if we were just to fill this with sand and cement and pull it up to ground level and feel bad about the investment we made, but it creates a tremendous amount of real estate. Thank you. And I don't know if that's something that you will decide upon or not. So actually for Marquette and Tijeras, I have two different proposals. The first thing is always look at the car counts. 4,100 cars per day, 5,400 cars per day. But look, peak hour, 868. That's a lot of cars, but it's still only 2 lanes of cars. Peak hour, 452. Peak hour, 588. 3,400 cars per day. Nowhere is this more than either of these more than a 2-laner needs to be. So what do you say we make them both 3-laners? So we double. We make the capacity twice what it currently needs to be. So in each of these images I'm going to show you, the existing right-of-way is on the top and the proposal is on the bottom. And what you see here is I'll back up. If we get rid of new Tijeras, then we can't have bike lanes on Tijeras because we're left with the old Tijeras, which is so skinny. So essentially the decision whether or not to remove new Tijeras determines whether that bike facility splits between Tijeras and Marquette, as I showed you, or is concentrated entirely on Marquette and leaves Tijeras alone. You got it? So if new Tijeras is kept, then we have a 1-lane cycle track on both Tijeras and Marquette. So what you see here is 13-foot lanes, 12-foot lanes. If you put in 10 and 11-foot lanes, you have room for parking on both sides of the street, and it only falls off at the corner where the turn lane is introduced, and the parked cars are protecting the cycle track. If new Tijeras is eliminated, then there's no bike facility. And one solution is simply to right-size the lanes, which gives us a 3-laner with a continuous turn lane. But this is less of a speeding message than that is, right? Now, what about Marquette? If new Tijeras is kept, then Marquette only has to handle traffic in one direction. It's the same design as this. But if new Tijeras is eliminated, then the whole cycle track for its full length goes on Marquette. And here that means we lose one side of parking, but we still have parking protecting the cycle track except for the corners. So this is the recommendation. And remember, these are roughly a 3-lane street is roughly a 20,000 car per day street, and these cars are experiencing half to a quarter. These streets are experiencing half to a quarter of that much traffic. So I could be more aggressive, but I don't feel I need to be. So here's the solution on the bike facility. You see MLK coming in and splitting between Marquette and Tijeras, or all consolidating. Oops, all consolidating. Look at the difference. It's either split or it's all consolidated. And that's all. Now, I'm going to take you through every single other street, but I'm going to do it really fast. You ready? I won't take you through that. Here's the base. Here's all the streets we looked at. We'll start with Broadway. I didn't spend any time on Broadway because Broadway already has an excellent solution. And it's what I described. It's a multi-way boulevard, 3 lanes in the middle, 2 lanes on either side, one of which is parking. So it's a 5-laner, but it really functions more like a 3-laner because these lanes aren't handling a tremendous amount of traffic. And it looks kind of like this, your European model, but these are being built all around the US. And you can see the car counts, 18,600, 18,000. So roughly in line with this chart. So a 3-laner should be able to handle it, particularly as VMT drops. But it's actually a 3-laner plus because of the service lanes that handle all of the conflicting and parking and stopping traffic. So that's your big fight with the state, and I'll help you do it. But I do think that's the right solution for Broadway, and this will be fantastic. And Innovate ABQ has every reason to fight for this, because it'll make Edo and that whole neighborhood just so much better. 2nd Street. What are the traffic counts on 2nd Street? 856, 500 peak hour counts, 6,600 per day, so it feels like a pretty healthy 2-laner. It's a 3-laner. The lanes are 14 feet, 13 feet, and 17 feet wide in places. And so here, remember we talked about the even-numbered streets as cycle tracks. Here there's room for a 2-way cycle track on one flank of 2nd Street. Protected by parking, then the parking drops off where you need to have the turn lane. And they're ample, they're 11-foot lanes to hold the buses that go on 2nd Street. Now, I'm showing you this just so you know, what's important are the principles, not the specific solutions. And I'm giving you specific solutions because I can't help it. But there's other ways to skin a cat. This is what I call the timid alternative. I thought if I called it timid, your public works department wouldn't dare do it. Because, you know, traffic engineers never want to be called timid. So the timid alternative is to say that we don't believe in cycle tracks. We're not ready for cycle tracks yet. We're just not that excellent. And we're gonna do integrated lanes. Just to show that you can split the cycle track into 2 integrated lanes and the same outcome, the same street works. But I don't recommend that. And then 2nd Street has some narrower parts. You just squeeze everything up a bit, it still works just fine. And there's the regular solution and the timid solution. 3rd Street, traffic volume's a little bit less than 2nd Street. There's a 902 though, that's a big one. Almost a 2-laner, right? 484, that's more like 1 lane. 5,800 per day, less than 10,000. So this is actually my shire solution to a 2-laner with 15-foot wide lanes and 4 lanes at every corner, that you could just make it a continuous left-hand turn lane and 10-foot travel lanes. Now the buses want 11, but you've got 3 10s here. There's always a little elbow room. You can always lean over into that center turn lane a little bit. And again, it's an 8.5-foot bus. But what I really prefer, what I would recommend no matter what for the less traffic part of the street, but really the whole street could handle it, is this solution. Illegal in the DPM's going away. The solution of, 45 is the perfect measure for parallel parking on one side and angle parking on the other. If that angle is 45 degrees. It's got to be at 45, you can't do a 60. 16, 11, 10, 8. That is a beautiful, calm street. It doubles the on-street parking. Wherever you do the angle, it doubles the on-street parking. I haven't mentioned the real estate the retail expert Bob Gibbs, who wrote the book Urban Retail, says that every urban parking space in a retail corridor is worth $150,000 to $200,000 in annual revenues to stores. So this is money in the bank. The number of curbs you have painted red and yellow is alone a $20 million parking deck that you don't have to build if you fix that. And doing this, putting in the additional parking that's in this proposal, is probably another $20 million parking deck that you don't have to build. And it's money in the bank for residential, and particularly for retail and entertainment. And then, what if you guys say, crazily, well, we can't have angle parking here because we're worse drivers than everyone else in America? Then you could do this. You could just say, okay, well, what do we use up the extra space with? I'd rather have the extra space used up, so put in bike lanes instead, but I don't recommend that. 4th Street is a street that's very narrow, and the pedestrian part is being changed. I had some influence on the ultimate design that was built, I'm not sure how much, but I didn't get involved in that. I'm not getting involved in that now because it's being done. I try not to criticize things that are being built as I speak. But there's other parts of the street that are also, they have 13-foot lanes. This is not a horrible street. People don't speed on this. But to send the message, well, frankly, to acknowledge that 4th Street is a designated bicycle corridor through the downtown, and to send the message of bikes welcome and slower speeds, then we have this solution, which, yes, puts 5-foot bike lanes between 7-foot parking lanes. Cars are 6 feet wide. 7-foot parking lanes and 9+ foot driving lanes. Oh, isn't that too tight? Isn't that dangerous for a bike? Well, this will encourage slower speeds than this will. So I actually recommend that you stripe it, particularly because it's part of a bike corridor. here. You can see how these are integrated lanes, this is bikes only, this is shared space, and then more integrated lanes. 5th Street, not very high counts, 550 peak hour, 5,300 per day. I'm recommending essentially a similar solution, but these lanes at the corner, look, 13, 13, 13, you can keep the parallel parking for the whole length of the street instead of cutting it off. Right now it's cut off really far from the corner. And you can run it all the way to the corner, and that still fits. 6th Street is another designated bicycle corridor, and you can see it has moderate traffic and then lightens up, but it's quite wide here. It's narrower here. And so for the wider segment, we can do again what we had proposed on 2nd Street, right? It's a cycle track, and then as it narrows, we have, I would rather, the typical response would be just to mark sharrows, to mark bicycle logos in 2 16-foot wide lanes. But I think that actually encourages more speeding than having parallel parking on one side and having bike logos in 11 and 12-foot lanes. So that's what I'm recommending there. And you see that where the buffered lane, because the road gets narrow at Copper, becomes simply sharrows, shared space that's marked prominently. Those are all the north-south streets. There are more of them, so we're more than half done with the streets. Now Lomas carries a lot of cars. It's a 7-laner though. It carries 24,000 per day, 22,000 per day, 2,200 at peak hour. So here the peak seems to be spread out more of what you expect. The peak hour is usually 1/10 of the daily, and that's like 2,400, 2,400, 2,400, 2,100, 1,700. And it happens to lighten up as you get around the part of the street actually that's more walkable, where people are more likely to walk. The only part of Lomas, frankly, where people are likely to walk along it is by the 3 corners of Law and 1 corner of Silver Jewelry. And notice though, this again. So Lomas by this chart could be a 3-laner. I'm not asking that, but I do feel that that lower volume part of Lomas in here could easily be a 5-laner instead of a 7-laner. And you accomplish that with a right-hand turn lane here and a right-hand turn lane there. And what this map is that we're going to get to, this is the walkability network downtown. This is where people do more walking and are likely to do more walking downtown. And notice this one part of Lomas is where there's reason to walk. And so what I'm suggesting is that for just that part of Lomas, we make it a 5-laner instead of a 7-laner and bring in that wonderful parallel parking to protect the sidewalk, to serve people going to those buildings up there, and to make it actually a much more livable street. But then elsewhere where it's basically a highway, but there might be the occasional person who's unfortunately having to walk along the sidewalk, if we make all the 11-foot lanes and 12-foot lanes 10-foot lanes and 11 for buses, you get a nice little buffer next to the sidewalk, which frankly does almost nothing. But it does move the cars 3 further feet away from the sidewalk. So I'm recommending eventually, when it is restriped, a comprehensive Lomas restripe with the properly sized lanes and the buffer. But I think for this part that has less volume and more walking, a 5-lane solution makes a lot of sense. Roma has so little traffic that you don't count the traffic. No one in Public Works bothers to count it. Yet you have 3 lanes, which is a 20,000 capacity thing. You've got this extra bulb outs by the correctional center, making it a 60-foot street. And it's a perfect candidate for the angle solution we talked about before. You can fill these in, or you can just stripe them, and then these become handicap spaces. When you have this space next to a space, when you have this space next to a parking spot, it becomes a handicapped accessible if you do it right. And then again, the timid alternative, if you won't do angle parking, would be to put bike lanes in, but I don't see that as a better choice. MLK is fascinating. It's about 20,000 cars per day. It could be a 3-laner, but let's leave it a 5-laner. That's okay. It's 5 lanes. But I don't know what happened when this was planned, because we've got 13-foot travel lanes plus 3-foot buffers. I mean, at least there's a 6-foot bike lane, But you know, people are afraid to bike on this street because the cars are going so fast because it's 5 13-foot lanes. And I don't know where the 13-foot standard came from. So look what there's room for. If we do 10-foot lanes and 11-foot bus lane, you can actually do a cycle track on each side of the street. Now this makes sense when there's demand for parking, because the cars will fill those spaces and protect the cyclists. If there's no demand for parking, well, frankly, this is no worse than the other solution. But if there's no demand for parking, you can just do a big buffer between the travel lanes and the bike lanes. But this will be a much nicer bike. With the cars encouraged to go the right speed at a greater distance from the bicyclists, it's night and day to what's there right now. And again, just for the price of paint. Central's the biggie. Central kind of ain't broke, right? Central's a great street. It's working very well, but it could be better. But it could only be better if the merchants want, and I should say want, to give up this loading zone where their trucks park. Now, if you run a bar and the deliveries are at 8 a.m., you do not want to get up for those deliveries. And so you need to make it as easy as possible for trucks to come all during the day, to not have time deliveries in the parking zone, all those other things that allow you to get rid of delivery zones. But there are alleys and there are cross streets, and maybe we can convince the merchants to give up this delivery zone. Because if they do, then we can continue the Central Avenue cycle facility all the way westward, starting to the northwest, all the way into Edo. And the statistics from New York City, when they added cycle lanes to, I think, 9th Avenue, retail sales went up 49%. So talk to your merchants about that, because maybe they'd like to have retail sales go up more than they want to park the truck in front of their store. But they have to agree. There has to be a central servicing plan. We're gonna help you plan to do your servicing well so that you are excited about us doing this and continuing that cycle facility through Central Avenue. Now, as it is, Central is still a cycle way, because the bikes come in, and frankly, it's pretty calm, and they will bike in the street. And then if we introduce a bike lane in Edo, they'll stay on Central all the way to Edo, except for under the bridge. So we need to start under the train. We need to work on that as well. So this isn't an essential fix, but I think it is a better solution if the merchants agree. Central west of 8th, I showed this as an illustration of what the DPM does. So you took a 4-laner and you dieted it brilliantly into a 3-laner, and congratulations, and it's working all right, except the lanes are so wide and cars are going so fast that the cyclists take the sidewalk because it doesn't feel safe, because its design speed is 50 miles an hour, as far as I can tell. And so what it is it's 12 to 15 foot wide lanes and then 6-foot bike lanes. What if you made those lanes the right size? You could turn it into a cycle track. So 11-foot lanes, 10-foot turn lane, parking, buffer, and then a bike lane against the curb. There's, again, just for the price of paint. So I know there's even some what we call bike lash. And by the way, whenever bike lanes are introduced into a community, there's bike lash. A lot of drivers are like, I don't want to give up my space for bikes, and that always happens. And people just don't like change, generally speaking, even if it's good change or bad change. But this provides no less room for drivers than this. It makes the drivers much more comfortable because you're moving the bikes away from the cars. And drivers prefer the cycle track solution to the conventional solution. You're not reducing capacity in any way. And if anyone tells you this is reducing capacity, show them that FDOT study that shows you 10-foot lanes don't reduce capacity. So this is a win-win. I don't see any reason not to do it quickly. And then there's Central and Edo, and this is the really tough discussion to have. This is the one place in the entire proposal where I believe it makes sense to reduce capacity below what most people will tell you is currently needed. And there's a reason. So here's what Edo is right now. 5 lanes. They're 11-foot lanes. If you know Edo at all, I walked there from my hotel today. The sidewalks are extraordinarily narrow. If there's parallel parking, the sidewalk is too narrow. And if there's an adequate sidewalk, there's no parallel parking. But guess what? Retail needs both, okay? Here's the proposal, the latest proposal to come out of the EDO discussions and the evolution of the EDO plan. It's a 3-laner. It's got 3 travel lanes, it's got bike lanes, parking, and an ample sidewalk. Now, not shown here, but I think to be shown here, if I'm not mistaken, this turn lane goes away as you leave the intersection, becomes a treed median, and a place for the bus stops for the BRT that's coming. So a couple discussions to have. One is the question of the BRT, and the other is the discussion of the traffic volume. The BRT wants a dedicated lane, and the BRT should, for most of its trajectory, certainly have a dedicated lane. But the BRT really exists to rush people from walkable place to walkable place. The BRT's success will depend upon the amount of people who can walk to it, because every transit ride begins or ends as a walk. And what BRT can't be allowed to do is to so undermine walkability in those few places along its route that are walkable that it kills its own market. And it so happens that Central in EDO is one of those places, particularly with Innovate ABQ coming and all the housing that's been coming there. That's part of the market. That's where you want the walkability that generates ridership, not the fast speed that kills ridership. And so even though it's hard to imagine that it would not slow the bus a little bit, having the bus mixed with traffic so that we can have 3 lanes instead of 5 is what's going to make EDO a successful place rather than a not successful place for anything but zipping through. So I feel that very strongly. Now, what about the number of lanes? Here are the car counts. It's about, oh no, this is, I'm trying to look further right. It's about 20,000 cars per day over here. 2,300, something like that. They're significant car counts, and they're the sort that fills up a 3-laner. Now, right now, if you're in a bus, if you're on the rapid ride on Central, sometimes you have to wait for more than one light on Broadway. Traffic engineer from Nelson Nygaard did a study, and he said the reason for that wait is not the capacity of Central, but the timing of the signalization at Broadway. So the biggest challenge to the BRT and frankly to cars moving east-west on Central is going to be working with the state on that signalization, but it's not as much the capacity of Central. But in terms of driving now, look at this map. You have Lomas. I'm only showing you the real east-west routes. You have Lomas, Marquette and Tierras into MLK, Central, Lead, and Cole. 17 lanes total among them. Of all of these streets, only one of them has any chance of being pedestrian-friendly, walkable corridor, and that's Central. You understand? Just go there. Go here. Go here. Go there, go any place else, and you'll see. We don't want them to be dangerous, and we want to make them as safe as possible. But as you know, the safe walk isn't enough. The walk has to be safe, comfortable, useful, and interesting. The only place that can happen is Central. Therefore, our only opportunity for bringing walkability out of downtown and connecting it between these two neighborhoods, our only chance is Central. Add to that the logic of the network. Remember how networks function. It's not a branching, dendritic suburban system where there's only one path from everywhere to everywhere else. There's a million paths, a million different ways to get where you're going. And the network is inherently intelligent. Every driver is what's called an atomic actor, making individual decisions about where they face the least traffic. If you remove lanes from Central, the capacity of Central will shrink. But the capacity of the system as a whole is so oversupplied that there's ample capacity to absorb it, and people will simply adjust their behavior. This is what we saw in San Francisco when the Embarcadero freeway came down, when the Central Freeway came down, when the West Side Highway in New York came down, and there was no Carmageddon because people just took different routes, and there's capacity for that. So my main point about Central is that it's our only chance for east-west walkability. It's one of many ways to drive in and out of town, and let's let it be what only it has the chance to be, which is the connector between EDO and downtown. So I feel that pretty strongly, and that's the plan that we should support. Gold is not that busy, 348 peak hour, 2,200 per day, not even a two-laner in terms of capacity, so I think it fits very easily into the angle parking solution. Lead and coal are the two that were two-wayed already. A lot of cars coming over the bridge, but look, that's only 9,800 per day. That's probably only 2 one-way lanes. 7,700 per day, that's 1 or 2 one-way lanes. So it's still not a ton of traffic. And so lead has 4 lanes. And then if you look further west, 975 peak hour. So that's handleable in 2 lanes. Let's give them 3. 649 per peak hour. Let's give them 3 lanes. So you turn a 4-laner on lead into a 3-laner, which gives you room to continue that one-way cycle facility. And then coal, same thing. You turn a 3-laner with super fat lanes into a 3-laner with a cycle track and continuous parking. And then you have the eastbound facility. And then the bridges are just a matter of the buffer being in the wrong place. Someone put the buffer, instead of between the bikes and the cars, they put the buffer on the opposite side. You know, and I gotta tell you, the speed with which this intelligence is advancing is so fast that every time I give one of these talks, there's a lot of new stuff in it. And so we can't blame people. We can't say, you know, you messed up. Streets were striped a long time ago, and people learn more every day. And, you know, what we know now is that this would be a much more attractive bike facility with a big buffer between a bike lane and the driving lanes than with the bikes right up against the cars. And in fact, you know, you see a lot of spandex folks here, but you don't see much else because the cars are going so fast over that bridge. This buffer should also have a Jersey barrier. This is one place where you need an actual physical barrier in the buffer. And then heading east, again, buffer on the wrong side. As you head east from Broadway on lead and coal, you've got these parking spaces against the curb which oddly have an extra 4 feet protecting them while the bike lane is just hanging there right next to traffic. So if you move the buffer away from the parking and put it against the biking, you're done. So it's just simple striping. And I have to say, I'm not recommending two-weighing lead and coal because it's outside my study area and it's, you know, there's already so much I'm telling you to do. I do feel kind of like those streets are terrorizing those neighborhoods right now when they go up and down the hill. And I do think the next study, not by me, the next study should look into two-weighing those streets. But from the short term, this will make the biking much more popular. So that's all the streets. And now you see how the bike network fits in. Again, the lead and coal one-way pair, the Marquette and Tierras one-way pair that's maybe only on Marquette, the Central continuing all the way from up here to the highway over here, and then 2, 4, 6, and then Broadway. Signals, finally, and then we get to the fun part of the presentation. So are we over-signaled? The real question is, are we over-warranted? How many warrants do we have? How do you earn a warrant? How do you get the right to put up a signal? In most of America, you need to have 800 cars coming through the intersection from any direction, 150 of which are on the side street. So, you know, there needs to be a little bit of balance and 800 cars. So here are all the signals downtown. Here are the cars per day. I did my best to guess, and basically what happens is, remember, red is significant, green is moderate, blue is light, yellow is negligible traffic. If there's a moderate or a significant street involved, then you're getting a warrant. But if there's no moderate or significant street involved, and it's only light intersecting with light, or negligible intersecting with light, or negligible intersecting with negligible, you don't get a warrant. And these 19 signals can all go away. By the way, signals cost money. They cost money to move, and I'm recommending moving a bunch for two-weighing, right? They cost money to just keep going. In Cedar Rapids, they were about to pay $150,000 per signal just to keep them working. 19 signals is a lot of money. And if you get rid of these signals for stop signs, you'll save a lot of money. You could afford the paint. So there's 19 unwarranted signals, And let's remember this. So do we need to do it? No. Do we need to save lives? No. Should we? Probably. And please study it so we can have more data, because the data is still just this one study. So 19 unwarranted signals. I'm recommending, always stop signs on all of these streets, which means 3-way or 4-way. So that's the proposal for 19 new stop signs. We're done with the safe walk. This is theoretically a 2-hour presentation. I'd like to include some time for Q&A. I have half an hour left. There won't be any Q&A, but I will finish on time. The comfortable and interesting walk is made up of, first we'll talk about what makes a walk comfortable and interesting. I want to talk quickly about a Tiger Grant proposal that you may be aware of. We'll do the urban triage exercise. I want to talk to you about Civic Plaza. Comfort and interest factors. We like to feel contained. All animals seek both prospect and refuge. If our flanks are not covered from attack, we are not comfortable, which is why we go to places like this on holiday. And we've been talking for a long time about height to width ratios, and we love Salzburg, and this is Houston, which is the opposite of Salzburg. But the point is that it's the surface parking lot. The surface parking lot is the typical thing that undermines that comfort. And you have a lot of surface parking lots in your downtown, but it's where they're located. For example, at Central and Second, it's where they're located in key places on the pedestrian trajectories that they have to become high priority development sites. Tiger Grant proposal, I just want to show you because this is very important. It's happening, and I hope you find a way to fund it, with or without a Tiger Grant. This is such a bad experience. Noisy, smelly, boring, right? And this is the proposal. Have you seen it? To bring the sidewalks up to the track level, not the street, because the street would cost a lot more. And I want to show this to advocate for that, but also to say that this stuff is easy to get wrong. And you have to be careful, because look at how these buildings sit suburban-like, with all this empty space around them, not hugging the street, not holding the edge of the lot, and not behaving in an urban way. And we can't allow this sort of thing to happen. And actually the codes now don't allow it to happen. But just so you know, this very talented architect who did this drew that. So it just shows you how deeply it's sunk into our way of working to do suburban style businesses in urban locations. So these buildings need to hold the street edge. And then this, a pedestrian crossing with no cars on it, on the line of copper, I feel like it would feel less safe than any of the others because there's no supervision. And the history in the US of taking cars off of streets has been a history of failure because of fears of crime when you're not supervised by cars going by. And so I actually don't recommend a pedestrian crossing in that location. And when I see something like that, I say, okay, show me another city where that works, and then we'll talk. So please do, but I don't think there is one. But this is a great proposal. Just needs imagine how much nicer this would be with a building here against this sidewalk, rather than a fence against, I don't know what that is, right? But a building against the sidewalk. So here's a fun thing I do everywhere I go. It's the urban triage exercise. And the question is, if we need all this to walk, if we have to do all these things simultaneously, how do we do all that? The downtown's big, it can get expensive, and the answer is what's called urban triage, which is to say that of all these things, the one thing the city controls in the short term is the safe walk by restriping the street. But only in the long term can it influence through investment, through codes, ordinances, the stuff that goes up next to the street that makes it useful, comfortable, and interesting. So what we should do is look at the places that are useful, comfortable, and interesting already, knowing that we can fix the street, and then prioritize the fixing of those streets so that we have streets that have it all. And then we'll have pedestrians. So David Day drove me around for a full afternoon, and I graded every single segment of every single street, not in terms of its safety, or its poverty, or its wealth. It has nothing to do with that. Sometimes the poorest places get the highest grades because they have stuff against the street. But just whether it was a more pedestrian environment or a more automotive environment, because it was comfortable, useful, and interesting. And this is the map. And it's very interesting because not that much of it is that bad, and it's pretty well dispersed around, and it actually required a lot more subjective work to get from there to here. And this is what we call the primary network of walkability. And you can see how one grows out of the other, and what you do is you connect walkability to walkability, and you end up with this plan. And then this plan usually drives the priorities of what streets you make better first and where you locate, not just the city, but as a public sector, as a private sector, everyone's saying, this is where we want to see development first because it'll have the most impact. But yours is too big. I don't mean that it's too good, but it's just too big. And so this is too much to prioritize. So the question is, how can we make a better, more targeted prioritization? And when that happens, we go to an anchors and paths analysis. These are the key anchors in your downtown. The spine of Central continuing into Edo. The transit station where so many people without cars arrive. The 3 hotels, boom, boom, boom. The plaza where all the students are going to be working. Sorry, the Galleria, where all the students are coming, and it's a major institution downtown. City Hall, and the 3 corners of government, whatever it's called. Those are the anchors. These are the paths that connect them. And then you say, okay, what are the missing teeth? So first of all, yes, let's do these streets first. They'll have the most impact. If we fix these streets first, we will change downtown most dramatically, most quickly. But what buildings does that imply? In red are 17 buildings that become the most important next buildings to build in downtown, because they complete the network of walkability so that it becomes universally excellent, universally a space between the buildings, like this one right here. And by the way, this one right here is special because there's very little green in your downtown. And I realize some of that is where you're located in our country. Some of it is fear of the homeless, which we have to work around. And any nice place you make, homeless people will come. And the way to get around that is just to have them outnumbered by people who are walking because they have a reason to walk. And you know, the impressions, I'm leaving out the homelessness discussion that will be in the report. But the reason why homelessness seems like such a problem here is because you have so few non-homeless people walking. I mean, it's really true. You do not have a large homeless population. They're just such a large portion of your pedestrians. So understanding that we can't let that stop us from providing nice urban amenities, and understanding that there's almost no urban amenity besides your ginormous plaza here in downtown, that I think it would be great to, instead of putting a building on the sidewalk edge like I'm recommending everywhere else there's a gap, to have a linear green and a building set back against the alley, and that would be a really neat respite along that key east-west corridor in downtown. So that site and 16 others will be recommended as priority sites that the city should circle the wagons around and find ways to make them happen before other sites. And I'm sorry if you own a different site. And the Civic Plaza is fun to talk about as a city planner. Well, let's just say this. I was told not to try to fix it because I can't on a budget. But it's important to explain why this is so bad. And it's unfortunate because most of the things that it does wrong, we knew were wrong at the time this was built. So I apologize for the collective urban design, landscape, and architectural professions for this plaza that you have. First of all, you know, I mean, no one uses it for good reason. I saw one crowd, but turned out they were not real. And why? Well, first of all, it's too big. Now, you can have big plazas, and I understand what that means to have a plaza where every citizen can come and raise their voice. But compare it to your old plaza. I guessed it was twice as big. If you measure from building face to building face, it's 5 times as big as your old plaza. 5 times the area. And that's just too much. Next, it's got these moat edges. So what makes a plaza successful, we know as planners? It's got to have porous edges that connect it to all the streets and buildings all around it. And you've got these 2 edges to the north and the south that are either moats or moats plus walls, right? And you can't get in, and you can't get in. So you may as well have had a gate, a subdivision gate around your plaza. Then there's the missing street which on a plaza this big, if this was a shallow plaza, it wouldn't be an issue. But on a plaza this big and deep, the absence of 4th Street is really deadening it, because you don't have that energy of slow-moving vehicles bringing life to it. And then there's bad visibility, where you can't see through certain parts, which makes people uncomfortable. And then finally, it's not fixable. What I mean by this is that you can't even bring 4th Street through because it's broken, and the roof will cave in. So the useful life of the plaza is going away. And when it does, and all this walkability has caused all this wealth to come to your downtown, you'll be ready to invest in a new one. And all I'm suggesting is that you do something like this. Okay? Make it half the size, create a developable parcel that you can sell and make money on that helps you then pay for the new parking structure underneath it, which you access through this building and not through some big ramps that are linear and block it off. And then of course fill it with trees, and have trees that don't just shade you but also absorb heat and lower heat island effects. So obviously this is just a diagram, but I couldn't leave town without recommending something, so that's my recommendation. And you can see it's still big. I'm glad you like it. I'm glad some of you like it. It's still bigger than this one, but it's not out of the realm of a nice normal size plaza. And this becomes a really nice site. So final category, the short category is the useful walk. I'm going to talk to you about what the usefulness factors are, leveraging garages, and innovate ABQ. So the more mixed use a neighborhood is, the more walkable the neighborhood is, the finer grain of mixed uses, and the better balance between mixed uses. You ask yourself in any place like downtown Albuquerque, what uses are missing or underrepresented, and almost always it's housing. And when the housing comes back in significant number, everything else gets better. We're seeing that now in downtown Oklahoma City. They're probably not ahead of you, but they've started to get some housing in their downtown, and now the retail is better, the dining is better, the recreation is getting better. So my study area is this census tract where we've got 645 housing units on 313 acres. By the way, a lot of that's subsidized. We want more market rate housing to have people, of all kinds living in downtown. But that density works out to about 2 units per acre, which is this, right? Your most exurban sprawl subdivision is the same density that you have in your downtown. So clearly, it's not a dense place. There's a couple million square feet of office. Using standard formulas, that would suggest you've got about a 5-to-1 jobs to housing balance. I've seen worse. Boise is 43-to-1. But you're probably a little more than 5-to-1. So anything you can do to make more housing downtown is going to make downtown more successful. You happen to have a fair amount of office vacancy and a lot of Class C office. And what I learned from some of the developers in the community is that there should be some momentum, if it can be done affordably, to convert struggling office into housing. So that's a real effort we need to undertake. And then, use every incentive available. Understanding as a city, the more people you have living in your downtown, the better your tax rolls are going to be, and the better you're just going to be much healthier financially. And then the little trick I bring to a lot of communities I go do this, some of the communities I go to do this already, you don't do this already, is to focus on underutilized garages in order to make housing less expensive to provide. Why? Because developers, whether you require it or not, developers typically have to provide 1 or 2 spaces per unit to get financing to build their housing. They have to provide parking spaces. Those cost money. So they realized this in Lowell, Massachusetts, where I worked, and this was before I got there, but they were trying to fill all these lofts, turn all these disused lofts into housing, and the developers couldn't afford to do so, in a way that buyers could afford, until the city said, hey, we've got 5 municipal parking garages that have empty spaces in them overnight and some during the day too, and you can use them. And they wrote letters that the developers brought to the banks, and these parking garages counted towards their requirement, reducing the cost of their apartments by about 25%. So the lofts are now all full. You've got a bunch of parking garages in your downtown scattered around. some very nice ones. Here's the map, and unfortunately I couldn't get counts for all of them. I couldn't get counts of vacancy for 2nd and Gold or 4th and Silver, but there's significant vacancy in these two. So looking at them one by one, some number of 331 spaces are empty that will allow then these missing teeth to be filled more cheaply. Same thing with 4th and Silver, these are missing teeth nearby. Now 5th and Gold has enough empty parking in it, both daytime and nighttime, to float 150 units of housing. And then Alvarado has enough emptiness in it to float 350 units of housing. So you can see how we can use this as a tool to make the housing more affordable. Now this is part of it. Of course, the other part is to reuse the buildings you've already got. So we have two competing goals. One is to, frankly, it should be whatever gets you the housing more cheaply, more affordably. In the existing Class C or empty vacant office space, or building these new buildings on these missing teeth that we need to fill to make the walk better. Finally, the last category, Innovate ABQ, or as I'm calling it, Reknit the City. Tremendous opportunity to connect better across the railroad tracks. Here's the grid you used to have. And you see, there's some large sites, rail yards and all that, but the grid is really working its way through. And look at this, on both sides of the track, urbanism, small scale buildings, hugging streets. And that was lost when this happened, for many reasons, and you're not alone in doing this. But look at the comparison, just zooming in. And you can see how this connectivity has really been messed with. But Innovate ABQ is very wisely, the university is very wisely, as advised by one of the best architectural firms in the country, Perkins & Will, and your own firm, who I forget the name, but they did the train station and they're great. Someone will know their name. They were advised by that team to pick this site. They looked at a bunch of different sites that were no comparison in terms of access to urbanism, access to Edo, and just being right in the heart of things. And so they've selected this site for their new headquarters, which is going to bring a lot of, a lot of symbiotic development, spillover development. A lot of people are going to want to be near Innovate ABQ. So we need to plan not just for whatever they might happen to own, but for the whole area. And certainly the plan does something which we now know the Traffic Council will allow us to do, is to get rid of this piece of Tierras. So I'm not the first person to propose this, but to have Tierras come through on Tierras instead of connecting straight to MLK. Now what does that mean? It means you have to, instead of going through one light, you have to go through two lights. Cars have steering wheels, they turn. So you go straight, you turn, and you turn. Also, if these streets are both two-way, then most people are going to just do this or that. But this piece really breaks in half a prime developable parcel in an extremely awkward way. Now we can make buildings like this any day of the week, but it's hard for urbanism to make good spaces like that. So here it is. So the first thing is to just bring that back through and get rid of this. The next thing is to take Union Square, also known as John Street, through. So what you see here is we're keeping old Tierras. In this drawing, we're keeping new Tierras. We've eliminated this street, so now we have a really nice block here, and we've created a block structure across this whole site. It's basically now 6 blocks. But look at this kind of weird miasma of public space. Why is that happening? It's happening because this street isn't diving until there. And so we have to warp east, warp back, have these odd-shaped buildings. And it's a little bit awkward. Oh, and by the way, this plan, the Edo plan, also got rid of the Tierra swoop through there. So here you see old Tierras. Here you see new Tierras. Here you see what this forces us to do. And by the way, what I haven't mentioned, let's even look at this plan, because if you do this, this is such a win, even without making it better. Look what happens. Oh, I forgot to mention this. Copper comes across the tracks. Now, we have to work with the train folks to do this. Like train folks, they said we can't do it. But maybe we can do it. And we need to work through it. But I'm optimistic that there is a way to stage the trains and the timing, and perhaps have arms that come up and down when they need to, so that copper can come straight through. Notice we've eliminated the curve, but we've also completely rationalized this part of the plan. Let me show you what it looks like now. Look at this. So what we've done is we've taken copper and simply come straight across. This ramp doesn't begin to go uphill until here. So copper can come straight across the tracks all the way to Broadway. And this is now straight, and this is now straight. And now you've got 4 great developable parcels on that side. We even put a building here to hide this ramp. So you've got a great corner here. This is urbanism, and this is urbanism. But if we can get rid of old Tierras, new Tierras, we can do this. Let me show you again. Right? And you're getting a ton more. You're getting all of this developable land in through here, and you're getting a rational urban solution. And it just so happens to come in the right way that commercial is here, and Union is here, making what we call a turbine plaza. This would be one-way streets, two-way, two-way, one-way, one-way, just to work. It's like a roundabout, but it's an urban roundabout, and a very developable site. So that's the expensive but perhaps very profitable choice to throw away your bad investment in the swoopy new Tierras. There's a few other little things to take care of, like this big tunnel that burrows down towards 2nd Street. But you know, a building could sit over this. This could just be reconstituted. If you need to get down into that Galleria parking for service, just put it under a building. This is a very valuable site in the middle of your downtown. And you can see that's actually right there. So you can build over it. And that is everything. So before I finish, so that's, you know, I was here to do a walkability study, not a planning exercise, but I did want to draw a plan that is just something to think about as you move forward, that contains this. It contains the infill buildings we talked about. It contains the re-knitting and the Innovate ABQ site. It contains the respite along Central and the new plaza. So this one drawing does have a lot of the ideas that we talked about today. So it's not that different, but it would make an amazing new heart to your city. So thank you, but I need to, okay, you can clap, thank you. But I do want to thank all of you for coming, especially those of you who came twice. I want to thank all these people who met with me, and then these are the guys and gals who are above and beyond the call of duty and volunteering a lot of time and spending a lot of time with me. I won't read all the names out, but you can read them all, and I thank all of them as well. Let's all thank them.